Hello, I'm Ethan Levy, and welcome to my TED Talk. I would like to begin by making the statement that capitalism has allowed for massive growth in the West. One of the driving forces behind capitalism is private ownership. Certain things, however, even in the freest market economies, we have kept in the hands of the government, such as policing and border security, so as not to indulge any conflict of interest. Now, what happens when the private sector bleeds into what we would customarily deem to be the realm of the government? The answer to that question can be found by exploring the topic of this video, which is the private prison. Prison is meant as a form of regulated punishment. Depending on who you ask, its intended purpose is for retribution, deterrence, an attempt to rehabilitate the prisoners, or some combination of the three. It is a function of the criminal justice system. It is up to the governments who run their criminal justice systems to determine which avenue they would like to take. Now, using the US as an example, according to correctionalofficer.org, the purpose of the US criminal justice system is, and I quote, making offenders pay for and repent their criminal acts while delivering recompense to the victims, end of quote. Now, from this source, we can see that special attention is paid to retribution in the US. Now, I'll make an assumption and say that it is usually in a free society's best interest to keep crime low, that crime rates would decrease so that there would be a lesser need for prisons. Now, prisons suck a lot of resources from the government budget, and crime disrupts the status quo. But what are the repercussions when the opposite is true? When a conflict of interest presents itself, saying that it is better for some to keep crime rates high. This occurs when prisons come under the private jurisdiction. When this happens, the aim of punishment is no longer retribution, deterrence, or rehabilitation. Instead, it's profit. Now, the way the model works in part for private prisons is that the private prisons are paid a certain rate by the government for every inmate that they house. The cost of upkeep per prisoner is lower than the amount that the prisons charge the government. The difference between these two amounts is the profit that these private prisons make. Now, from a sociological perspective, the private prison system demonstrates a conflict theory view of society. In this case, the conflict is between wealthy operators of private prisons as well as their shareholders against their prospective prisoners, who are typically lower class individuals and minorities. Now, the business model is optimized when the system puts more prisoners in their prison. It is therefore in their best interest to keep crime rates high amongst the lower class for maximization of profit. In order to do this, private prisons support an environment which is most conducive to a steady rate of prisoners. This is evidenced through the donations that the biggest private prison companies in the US have made to Republican presidential and senatorial candidates who are typically against things like drug reform and harder on illegal immigration, and are therefore more likely to create an environment where more people are sent to prison. Now, some might say this sounds wrong. Some might ask, how have we allowed this to happen? Is the layperson complicit in profit driven imprisonment? Using Michel Foucault's idea of governmentality, one might argue that we are complicit. This idea says that we all contribute in some way to the oppressive means of societal control. In voting for the candidate who is much harder on drug reforms, one is contributing to a level of social control that puts more people in jail. In accepting the nature of the prison program with private prisons, rather than focusing on rehabilitation and reintegration, we are submitting to a level of governmentality that allows for private profit-driven prisons. In addition, in Foucault's work, Discipline and Punish, he challenged the narrative that the penal system has become more humane over time. The emphasis on mass incarceration and a lack of focus on rehabilitation leads to higher recidivism, which increases the rate of crime as well as increasing profit. This conveyor belt type system that looks to cycle prisoners into prisons for the sake of profit gives credence to Foucault's idea that the penal system has become less humane. Now, in the search for profit, prisons in the US, as well as in other Western democracies that have private prisons, have targeted an overwhelming number of visible minorities. Through the exploitation of these already marginalized communities, profits can rise. The exploitation of minority groups has been evidenced in the study Imprisoned Indigenous Women and the Shadow of Colonial Patriarchy by Eileen Baldry and Chris Cunneen. This study cites the rising incarceration rates of Indigenous women in Australia, despite the overall decrease in crime rate. Baldry and Cunneen assert that this is due to a patriarchal colonial system that has governed Australia. This can be analogized to the patriarchal colonialist system that sees the overwhelming incarceration of the African American community in the US and the Indigenous community of Canada. Private prisons have found a niche in these societies in which they exploit the patriarchal colonial system that puts minorities at a disadvantage to drive up profits. Now, unchecked capitalism allows for private prisons to operate in this capacity. Social control of the penal system becomes dictated by profit margins rather than the desire to create a just society. The question of private prisons is a question of priority. Placing profit as the number one priority aligns with the private prison model. The desire for a just and fair society is at odds with it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I'm Ethan Levy.